If you're struggling in the English section of the SAT, this video will cover 5 tips that you can implement today to improve your English score.
My first tip is to knock out the quick and easy questions first. Now, this is going to vary from person to person, but in general, I would say that words and context questions are going to go pretty quick. Either you know them or you don't. If you're not familiar with one or two of the words, you're going to want to mark for review and move on. And if you are familiar with the words, you can go ahead and eliminate answers until you get the correct one, or just choose the correct one if you see it pop out. But after you get through the words and context, I would recommend jumping to the standard English conventions. This is usually going to show up around question 15. And just like the words in context, if you know the rules, these should go pretty quickly and rack up some more points before you take time to analyze the more complex questions. My second tip is to ignore the notes on the rhetorical synthesis questions. We do not need to look at these. All we have to do is look for the goal. So what do I mean by the goal? The student wants to emphasize the role of misconception played in the naming of a place. So this is the goal. I would focus on a misconception and the naming of a place. Those are the two things I want to focus on. And you're going to see I don't need to look at my notes. I just go through and I ask myself, does it accomplish this goal or not? The novel Las Surgas de Esplandian featured a fictional island that has nothing to do with the naming of a place, so that's out. To the south lies Baja, originally called California after a fictional place. So it talks about the naming of a place, kinda, but it doesn't talk about a misconception, so that's out. In the 16th century, Spanish explorers learned of a peninsula off the west coast and called it California. So again, this talks about naming a place, but it doesn't say anything about a misconception, so that's out. And then hopefully our answer is D, thinking it was an island. That's a misconception. Spanish explorers called a peninsula California after an island in a popular novel. Boom. So we have the misconception, we have the naming of a place, so we're good to go. And we didn't have to look at our notes. So just like you want to focus on the goal on rhetorical synthesis questions, my next tip is to focus specifically on the claim for command of evidence questions, specifically supporting the claim or hypothesis or weakening the claim or hypothesis. So we can see from this one, it wants us to support the researcher's claim. So instead of worrying about reading this entire thing, I'm just going to try and find that specific claim. Boom, last sentence. Thus, they claim that the two languages with very different spoken rates can nonetheless convey the same amount of information. So the claim is two languages, different rates, convey same amount of information. And if I were actually highlighting, I might even just focus more on this part. So two languages with very different spoken rates, same amount of information. Those are the important parts to me. And I'm going to go through and I'm just going to cross out the wrong answers. Among the 5 languages, Thai and Hungarian have the lowest rates of speech and the lowest rates of information. Okay, so I'm not even going to look at the chart because it's talking about a low rates means low information, but we're trying to figure out, can different rates have the same amount of information? So that just goes against the claim, so we get rid of it. Vietnamese conveys information at the same rate as Spanish, despite being spoken at a slower rate. So that could be true. Let's look at our chart. Vietnamese and Spanish. And I actually wouldn't highlight this. I'm just highlighting this for your sake, but personally, I'd probably just look at it. It's really up to you. Information is pretty dead even. We have 42 versus 42.5, so that is true. And then Vietnamese, despite being spoken at a slower rate. So yeah, Vietnamese is at a slower rate than Spanish. So B is true and probably our answer. I'm so confident I'm going to mark it, but if you weren't feeling as confident, you can go through and eliminate the others. Among the 5 languages, the language spoken fastest also conveys information fastest. Again, that's against the claim, so we wouldn't even need to look at the chart. Serbian and Spanish are spoken at the same rate, but Serbian conveys information faster than Spanish does. So that's kind of the opposite of what we were looking at. We do have a close rate. It's not super close, but then the rate of information conveyed is different. So that's kind of the opposite of what we were looking for. So again, that would be out. And honestly, for this particular question, we could have gotten away with not even looking at the chart, just going off of the claim. I would definitely recommend checking in with the chart if you have the time, but if you were in a pinch, if you were running out of time, this would be a great strategy if you were, down to the last few seconds, for example. Staying on this page, my next tip is to do what I've been doing this whole time using the crossout tool. The reason that I'm doing this is because it feels good and it helps me go faster. Having too many choices causes anxiety. So the sooner you can start to eliminate wrong answers, the sooner you can choose your correct answer with confidence. And my final tip is to get comfortable with punctuation rules. Punctuation, or what they call sentence boundary questions, account for a majority of the conventions of standard English questions. If we look through, let's just count them up here. Punctuation, we'll say we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, so that was 5 out of 6 of the questions here. So as you can see, quite important. And like I said before, when you do know your punctuation rules, you can pretty quickly get through these types of questions. So for example, if we're working on this one and I'm trying to eliminate answers, for A, it's pretty clear that we don't have a full sentence right here, so we can't have a period. For this next part, a semicolon usually acts like a period, so that's also not going to work for the same reason. Looking at C and D, D is a colon. And before a colon, we need a full independent clause, which we do have. And then after a colon, we're usually going to have a list, an example, a quote, or a cliffhanger. So here we have 2 items. That is an item of 2, which means it's a list, which means D totally works.
This will take some time and practice, but you can get started with this video on how colons work. It covers 4 ways that colons work specifically on the SAT.